Hi, I'm Izzy Conn at the Institute of Historical Research, and welcome to Leading Labour and this episode on James Callaghan. For the last year, I've been interviewing senior insiders and experts to understand the stories of each former Labour leader since 1945. We look at how each leader responded to major national and international developments, managed the ever-present tension between the left and right of the Labour Party, and overall how they sought to win elections and bring Labour into government. Callaghan took over from Harold Wilson in 1976, after serving as Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary and Chancellor. Callaghan's leadership isn't held in high regard. It was plagued with crises and culminated in the winter of discontent and Thatcher's first election win in 1979, which also led to 18 years of Labour being in opposition. But this episode might go some way to shining a light on the capabilities of Callaghan. We're going to start this episode by hearing from political historian and professor at Nottingham University, Stephen Fielding, about the balancing act that Labour leaders face and how some of those applied to Callaghan.
The Labour Party, as an institution, many of its members, want radical socialist progressive change, and they want it now. And of course, the party's also got a special link with the trade unions, who've got a very specific interest in all kinds of issues. And to maintain itself in office, it also has to appeal to those beyond that constituency. And that balancing act between a more radical kind of imperative, so far as the voters are concerned, small c conservative, more limited kind of objectives, is something that any Labour leader has to try and manage. When you're in office, if you're the kind of leader that Jim Callaghan was, you want to manage capitalism to make it productive, to make it grow, while also making society fairer. The problem for Callaghan was that he became leader in 1976 in the midst of appalling economic circumstances, when actually trying to balance those two things was, in his eyes, at least in the short term, almost impossible.
So what was Callaghan's background?
He came from relatively poor background, working class Portsmouth, and the situation wasn't made any better when his father returned from the First World War and soon died of his injuries. So it was a single parent family in a relatively poor working class background, but a working class sort of background in which there was a kind of sense of collective self-help, even though the state government wasn't really helping people in the 20s and the 30s, that working class people could help themselves.
Callaghan didn't go to university.
The family was way too poor for him to even think about going to university. And so he entered the lower reaches of the lower middle class, became a civil servant working for the tax office. And I think he saw the Labour Party as a way through which he himself personally could continue his kind of upward trajectory.
We heard from political historian Lewis Baston last week on Wilson, and he joins us again to discuss Callaghan.
His politics came as a result of his trade unionism and his experience of life and work, and a certain amount of self-taught socialism. He joined the Labour Party in 1931, largely as an outgrowth of his trade union activity in the Inland Revenue Staff Federation.
It's really notable that Callaghan didn't go to university. Churchill and John Major are the only other post-war prime ministers who didn't go, and Jeremy Corbyn is the only other Labour leader. It did impact Callaghan throughout his political career, mostly in the way that he personally felt in comparison to his colleagues. The idea of educational diversity is a topic of ongoing debate in how representative the House of Commons truly is. In 2025, 90% of MPs have an undergraduate degree, while only 34% of the British population overall do. Here's Stephen Fielding with more.
In the cabinet, in the shadow cabinet, and then Prime Minister, he was surrounded by people who are generally regarded to have been, the most talented generation of Labour leaders, all Oxford firsts. And I think he did feel the weight of that, and that maybe people might look down upon him. When you read about him, there's often various people who say, mention the fact that he isn't, he didn't go to university, an idea that he has to prove himself. But I think it also meant that he had a sense that he had a greater connection with kind of core Labour voters, the ordinary voter.
He was a lieutenant in the Navy during World War II, serving in the East Indies Fleet. and became an MP in 1945, part of the huge 1945 class of Labour MPs that we've heard about.
Not just being elected in 1945, but actually being of a certain age during the Second World War and seeing the changes that the Second World War with a Labour, significant Labour representation in. Working people's lives were significantly improved during the Second World War. All the things that they were told couldn't happen during the 1930s, all these things happened during the war. And he saw that, like others of his generation. In his memoirs, he relates the publication of the Beveridge Report as being, this was like a foundational moment that people's lives could be transformed quite modest ways, but nonetheless transformed.
Class of 1945, the important things about them are a lot of idealism powering it, but you also had this kind of rather ruthless practical streak that goes with having seen war, I think. And Callaghan was very much part of that generation.
Callaghan believes strongly in the Attlee settlement, welfare state and mixed economy, meaning that key industries were nationalised.
The settlement, as it would become known, that was his foundational moment. This is something how he defined his politics, for good or ill, and obviously he would consider that to be for the good. And when he became Prime Minister, he saw it, I think, as his mission to defend that settlement, both from the far left and from the far right.
I was really lucky to interview Tom McNally for this episode. Tom is one of the best people to talk to about Callaghan's leadership, as he was his political secretary from 1970 until 1979. Tom later became an SDP candidate, and today he's a Liberal Democrat peer in the Lords. Here's Tom on how he started working for Callaghan.
When Labour rather surprisingly lost the 1970 election, I realised that many of the senior figures would be short of assistance. And so I wrote to Jim Callaghan and said that if he wanted me to do any research or speech writing or general dog's bodily work, I'd be very happy to do so. He replied, asked me over to the Commons to see him in a very small office, I remember. And his only aide at that time was his secretary, Ruth Sharp, who was one of those formidable ladies that worked around the House of Commons at that time as MP secretaries. And I remember from that first meeting, Ruth bustled in and said to Jim, I've said no to this, I've agreed to go to that, I need your opinion on that, and went out. And I remember Jim looking up and saying, always remember, if you keep a secretary too long, you end up working for her. And for the next 2 years, I worked very closely with him in opposition and travelled a lot with him, which I think is one of the ways you really get to know people. So we travelled to Eastern Europe, to the Soviet Union, to the Middle East.
When Wilson won in 1974, Tom went to the Foreign Office with Callaghan and then to Downing Street when Callaghan became the Prime Minister in 1976. Callaghan is the only person to ever have held all 4 great offices of state, the most prominent government positions: Prime Minister, Chancellor, Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary. Let's hear from Tom on his memories of the time that Callaghan spent as Foreign Secretary.
He was a big man in that he was very good with people who worked with him, who worked for him, for the people he represented. And he was also a tough man in dealing with people he had to be tough with. I remember a meeting with Gromyko, who was Soviet foreign minister, which had been meant to last about half an hour and lasted about 3 hours, while he and Jim went toe-to-toe in a very robust manner.
As Chancellor, Callaghan ended up resigning during the devaluation crisis of 1967, which we obviously heard about last week in the Wilson episode. Here's Stephen on what his experience as Chancellor gave him.
It's defined by not wanting to devalue the pound, but that was largely a decision that Wilson imposed on him, but he went along with it. And then it ended up being the pound was devalued, and so he had to resign as a kind of a failure. He became prime minister. He said he didn't really want to get involved in the economy too much. His fingers had been burnt when he was Chancellor.
But his time as Chancellor did instill in him a realistic view of the Treasury that not many prime ministers have.
The most difficult kind of problems that his government had was dealing with the economy. He had insights, and I think he was quite sceptical a lot of the time about the Treasury view. And he did look for alternatives. So it gave him an independence, I think, of the Treasury recommendation.
Holding all these senior offices clearly made Callaghan experienced.
It's actually very, very useful to have insights in the three great offices of state. But I think, you might be right to say it's kind of overstated. Jim Callaghan was a very ambitious politician. He was ambitious to get on within the party, and that certainly by the time he became Chancellor in Wilson's government, I think he probably thought that he had dibs on the leadership by that point.
So when Wilson resigned, Callaghan stood for the leadership. What wing of the party did Callaghan come from?
He was certainly politically of the centre. He was, by this point, by no means on the left. But he wasn't of the revisionist right, of the kind of the almost anti-union right that, say, Roy Jenkins was part of. So he was kind of on the solid centre ground of the party.
Tony Benn, Michael Foot, Roy Jenkins, Dennis Healey and Anthony Crossland all stood too, and they were all Oxford graduates. The electorate then was still only Labour MPs, and Callaghan won with 56.2% of the final vote. Michael Foot came second.
Where Wilson was sort of quicksilver and tricky, and Callaghan was this stolid, reassuring kind of presence.
And by this time, he'd been Home Secretary, Chancellor, Foreign Secretary, and, he was the shoo-in, essentially, by that point.
He succeeded Harold Wilson in 76. Harold rather mischievously said that he'd made way for an older man.
Callaghan had a good relationship with much of the cabinet. He did, though, have tension with Barbara Castle. He had sabotaged, in place of strife, her measures to limit the power of the trade unions. Stephen Wall, a former senior diplomat who we've already heard from during the previous episodes, worked as a civil servant with Callaghan when he was Foreign Secretary. Here's his and Tom McNally's view.
I think Jim Callaghan is a very interesting politician because I think he was, in his earlier career, he was pretty opportunistic. When Harold Wilson and Barbara Castle tried to make trade union reforms, Callaghan was the guy who, again, because he wanted to be leader of the Labour Party, sided with the trade unions.
To put no finer point on it, Jim Callaghan sabotaged it and took the side of the trade unions. I think it was a mistake at the time that in place of strife was a way forward for the Labour Party and the trade unions, but Jim stuck with the trade unions. He saw that a Labour government, to succeed, had to keep the trade unions on board.
But I think when he became Prime Minister, he was actually a very statesmanlike Prime Minister.
So let's start by looking at what the situation in the country was and in the party that he inherited from Wilson.
He inherited, of course, from Harold Wilson the problem of Europe and a great deal of the problems of besetting the economy at that time, and the challenge of keeping the trade union side of the party on board whilst trying to manage the economy.
Callaghan's inheritance from Wilson was not fantastic. You can see it starting to develop in the late 60s, but sort of by the mid-70s you have very high inflation. That's a problem in economic management across the board. It's a problem in sort of social relations as well. And you've got this new economic problem of stagflation. The idea that inflation can be high, which is generally sort of regarded as the economy overheating, and unemployment's high as well, which is usually a sign of the economy running too cold. So you have these at the same time, which is a baffling problem for economic minds at the time.
The trade unions were powerful and there had been a lot of strikes, most notably in 1974 at the end of the Heath government, which culminated in the 3-day working week when the country only had electricity for 3 out of 5 working days.
In a sense, the trade union movement had been able to refuse Wilson in place of strife. It had made the Heath's Industrial Relations Act unworkable. You had a very powerful set of institutions in the trade unions, which restricts what you can do by means of economic policy and pay and so on.
British society had changed in the 60s and 70s, of which the vast social changes brought in by Wilson were a big part.
The decline of deference is a big thing. I mean, it's a positive development, and people aren't willing to put up with rubbish anymore. Working class people, women, minorities, etc., all more assertive. Britain's harder to manage than it was 20 years earlier. Economic circumstances are very difficult, but people also have rising expectations. And the 70s, I think, are misrepresented quite a lot. I mean, they're a time when a lot of people acquire sort of aspirational middle class sort of lifestyle. You've got a lot of growth of sort of affluent society things against this backdrop of economic problems and high inflation. And it's quite a difficult scene to manage across the board. You've got a parliament where Labour starts off with a majority of 3, and that disappears pretty much the day that Jim Callaghan becomes Prime Minister, so you're having to manage without a parliamentary majority.
Tom McNally explains that Callaghan was well placed to manage this scene.
The fact that he had taken the position he had on in place of strife, and this long history of involvement with the trade unions, he was able to manage that very key internal party division on what governments can do and what trade unions want them to do when a Labour government's in office.
There were books at the time saying, is Britain becoming ungovernable? Callaghan, at least until quite close to the end, was about demonstrating that Britain was governable.
So, let's look at Callaghan's strategy.
When he became Prime Minister, Callaghan's whole strategy was to try to put himself between his own party and the electorate. He wanted to be sort of the reasonable, conservative, moderate, reassuring face of Labour traditional values, kind of Clement Attlee values. The basic priority of the government, which was to stabilise, this all sounds very familiar now, to stabilise the economy, to reduce inflation, to get growth and investment back into the economy. These were kind of priorities that Wilson had adopted with the full support of Callaghan, so he was just going to continue it.
During the end of his years, Wilson had started to lose trust across the party, whereas Callaghan was more able to keep the different wings on board.
He won the trust even of the likes of Tony Benn in terms of what he was trying to do, and he involved them in discussion, although, he took it in the same direction as Wilson would have done.
Callaghan appointed his cabinet and started by sacking Barbara Castle.
In a very kind of vicious, nasty bit of revenge. And there was a lot of bitterness there. So she was out.
I remember walking into the cabinet room and he was stood hunched kind of with his knuckles on the desk after she'd left. And he said, I never want to go through that again. Because she had not gone easily.
He made Dennis Healey Chancellor, and he kept Tony Benn on side, who was prominent on the left.
He essentially retained the same cabinet that Harold Wilson had, and Benn made it very clear that he wanted to be re-promoted. He thought that Callaghan should put him back into the centre of things, and or he might resign. Had Ben resigned at this point, as a kind of figurehead of the left, it would have been a very tricky situation. Over 3 or 4 days, Callaghan managed to persuade Ben to stay in Energy. He wasn't going to get promoted, and he kind of soft talked him into kind of trusting him. And he brought Michael Foot, who was one of the kind of old left. If Ben was a new left, Foot was the old left. Brought Foot closer into decision making. So he kind of kept it as a Wilson cabinet, which meant it was sort of centre-right with one or two left-wingers in it. But the direction of travel was certainly away from the agenda that many on the left would have wanted.
There were a lot of different views going on in the cabinet and in the parliamentary party.
Tribune group in Parliament was a bit like the conservative Eurosceptics in the sort of 90s and 2000s. You have this group almost with whips and policies of its own, and the government has to have the Jenkinsites on one side, you have the Tribune group, you have the cabinet representing these different groups as well. I think one of the underestimated things about Callaghan is that he kept his cabinet together, even though it was wildly diverse in ideological terms.
The first thing that the government does really is get a loan from the International Monetary Fund.
The British economy is still in some kind of trouble. The pound is tumbling in value. And essentially, in order to keep things going, the government needs a big IMF loan. At least it's told that it does. The IMF is willing to give the government money as a loan, but it's also got lots of conditions. You've got to cut expenditure, right, in all these different ways, quite big ways. So Callaghan gets the cabinet to discuss the different kind of responses to this situation. One of which is like Ben's, which is we've got to basically reject all of these conditions and go it alone, have a kind of siege economy. To the Chancellor, Denis Healey's proposition that we have to basically accept what they say.
Callaghan really managed divisions during the IMF crisis and avoided any proper splits in the cabinet. Here's Tom McNally.
Jim spent an enormous amount of time with each member of the cabinet. I remember he'd been seeing one of the cabinet members, Stan Orme, and he'd taken an inordinate amount of time talking to him. And I said, it is annoying when so much is at stake. And he said, no, that we've got to let them make this decision. They've got to be satisfied themselves that we're going the right decision, and they need the time to talk it through and think it through, and I'm willing to give them the time. And I think that was how he did it.
Callaghan doesn't declare his position, which is basically to support the Chancellor, and allows all the different groups to put their case and to debate it. And at the end of about 3 or 4 days, they've exhausted themselves. So Callaghan could then come at the end and say, well, this is what I think. That seems to be the abiding virtue of Jim Callaghan's time as Prime Minister. He kept the Labour Party, he kept the cabinet together.
I always pointed out that I think we borrowed 4 billion, which would look like small change these days, and we paid it back within 2 years. And by 1978, all the economic indicators were going in the right direction. Jim saw the key to the IMF decision was to use that time to get inflation under control. Inflation had risen to the high 20s. By 1978, it was down to single figures.
Despite governing in very uneasy times, the Callaghan government still brought in progressive legislation.
Well, when people talk about Jim Callaghan, they always use the word conservative. They always say, well, he wasn't really a liberal. Jim Callaghan was certainly not a progressive. He wasn't a liberal, but he wasn't illiberal. As a politician, I think he's had an unfair reputation.
I was lucky to speak to historian Pat Thane, professor in contemporary British history at King's College London. She's done a lot of her research on social progress in Britain, especially focusing on women. Due to sound quality issues, we were unable to use the recording, but I'm just going to talk you through what she told me. She said that the Callaghan government is underrated for its progressive social changes. It was a time when income inequality was at its narrowest point of the century, and the welfare state reached its peak. The Equal Opportunities Commission was set up in 1975, which supported women to be able to take cases of discrimination to court, including to the European Court of Human Rights. Also, the women's liberation movement were very active in campaigning against domestic violence, which she told me that they always had been, but they were especially active during this time. and it led Labour to introduce the Domestic Violence and Matrimonial Proceedings Act in 1976, which made domestic violence a specific offence for the first time. Domestic violence victims were further helped in 1977, when legislation was introduced to support people who were made involuntarily homeless, which obviously especially helped victims of domestic violence. Callaghan came into power 1 year after the first referendum on Europe, so division within Labour on that issue had mostly been settled. In 1979, Callaghan made a decision that did impact Britain's position in Europe. Let's hear from Stephen Wall about how this developed.
There was the big issue, though, which I think was one of the decisive issues in our membership, which was the introduction of the exchange rate mechanism, which was Helmut Schmidt's idea, the Chancellor of Germany. And the first person he approached, we're talking sort of 77, 78, he approached about it was Callaghan. And only after that did he approach Giscard d'Estaing. Now, for Callaghan, it was sort of an impossible proposition, really, both economically, given the state of the economy, and also kind of politically, because of the state of the Labour Party. Giscard faced opposition from within the Banque de France and the French finance ministry, but decided that for political reasons he would do it. And I think that really cemented the Franco-German relationship and the Franco-German sort of leadership of the European community. And I think there are a number of sort of things that you can point to, which are sort of signposts towards Brexit. And I think in a funny kind of way, that's one of them, because although we constantly talked about having a leadership role in Europe, we never quite kind of achieved it.
Callaghan was governing with no majority, so he reached an agreement with the Liberal Party, whose leader was David Steele, to help bring some stability.
Lib Lab Pact was March 77 until summer 78 was an agreement that we now would term a confidence and supply agreement between Labour and the Liberal Party. The Conservatives had tabled a vote of no confidence in the government, and it looked like that was going to pass. And so rather than be defeated in the vote of confidence, Jim Callaghan and David Steele talked, and they came to this agreement. It suited neither party for there to be an election at that stage in 77. So they had this agreement which basically pulled the rug from under Margaret Thatcher in this confidence vote. Effectively, it was a year and a half of life support for the government that had lost its parliamentary majority. After the IMF crisis, it's really pretty bad. There's restrictions on incomes, there's high inflation. By the end of the Lib Lab Pact in summer 78, the picture is a whole lot better. The economy's growing quite strongly, inflation's down, unemployment started to fall.
After Callaghan leaves office, the party is incredibly divided. So let's look at the root of all that division. Here's Tom McNally.
Harold Wilson put it best. He said leading the Labour Party was like driving a stagecoach. And if you kept it going at a steady pace, everybody inside was exhilarated by the movement and broadly satisfied. But if you pulled up to consider your direction, everybody got out and started arguing.
And was only elected by MPs. And there's very little that we know about what the wider membership might have thought. But I mean, what little suggestion there is that they probably would have gone for Callaghan as well. But the activists wouldn't have. The wider membership would, but most activists probably would have voted for Tony Benn or Michael Foot. It was a divided party in that sense.
It has been argued by some that Callaghan's speech at the 1976 conference changed modern Britain, as it saw Labour accept the changing economy and accept some of what Thatcher, who at this point was the Conservative opposition leader, stood for, and accept that the post-war consensus on the economy was failing. In the speech, he said, "We used to think that you could spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you in all candour that option no longer exists, and insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy, followed by a higher level of unemployment at the next step." Here's Stephen Fielding.
He was basically saying, look, we've got to stop prioritising full employment as a key government measure, and we've got to start prioritising reducing inflation. I've seen that speech on YouTube, and it was a very muted response. And there were people in the National Executive Committee who refused to stand to give him an ovation at the end of his speech, which is kind of pretty unprecedented.
The speech attracted criticism and was actually a big change. In Tony Benn's diaries, obviously on the left, a few weeks later, he wrote, "Somehow the whole world is whirling and it is having a physical effect on me. I actually feel physically ill." Another thing going on at this time was that many on the left were attempting to get rule changes to democratise the way that the party internally operated.
So he definitely had a difficult time. He definitely had problems with the parliamentary Labour left and with certain activists. These were difficult times. So I'm not at all surprised. I mean, the surprise is that he managed to keep everything together until the 1979 election.
So Callaghan was clearly good at managing people, a strength that, as we heard with Wilson and Attlee, is incredibly important for successful Labour leaders. But let's look a bit more closely at this and at some of his other strengths. Here's Stephen, then Lewis, and then Tom.
Jim Callaghan was really good at managing people at that top level. That he could win their trust, if only because he allowed them to speak and he appeared to be listening and to be taking them seriously, even if he disagreed with them.
I mean, nobody resigns over policy. And considering the amount of really tough stuff that happens, I mean, the cuts, the IMF crisis and so on, he manages cabinet by giving people their say.
I remember at the height of the IMF crisis, I always remember he said, unless a Prime Minister and a Chancellor are at one, a government won't survive. It's the key to the success of any government. And I've got to stick with Dennis through this, which he did.
And he's also pretty astute at promoting people as well, I think. I think Callaghan had a more kind of organic view of how political careers work, and probably derived from his own experience.
Earlier in his career, Callaghan had been labelled by some as a thug and a bully. Callaghan said to documentary maker Michael Cockrell, "I only believe in bullying people like you, who are my equals and can stand up for themselves." But in Number 10, he seemed to have mellowed more.
Called him Big Jim, and he was, I think, a big man in both in stature and in his relationships. Sometimes you'd get caricatures of him that he was a pen portraits that he was a bully. I never saw him bully anybody that wasn't either his equal or in a bigger position than he was.
Callaghan also worked very hard and was on top of detail.
I remember again we had a meeting with Lord Weinstock, who was then one of the kind of stars of British industry, about the future of nuclear. And Jim had just took a whole load of briefing papers off over the weekend, and when he came back, we started the meeting, and Lord Weinstock started to speak slightly patronisingly to Jim, and he suddenly hit the deck, bang, everybody's trying, and he said, now you and I, we can have a very constructive meeting, but not if you're going to conduct it on that basis. And then he fired off a number of questions to Weinstock, which clearly showed a knowledge of the subject and an understanding of the subject.
Obviously, Callaghan had been ambitious, but as Tom remembers, he was focused on doing the best job he could once he was in Number 10.
He once said to me, he said, you know, I used to ache to be Prime Minister. Ache. And then he said, and then I stopped aching and it came along. And he said, you know, I just want to do the best job I can while I'm in it. And he was, I think, extremely kind. Well, I saw it in both his attitude to me and his attitude to people who worked with him.
While we're looking at Callaghan's personality, let's hear from Tom about a story of him and Jim meeting Willie Whitelaw, a huge Conservative figure from the time, on the campaign trail.
One story I do tell about the 1974, February 74 election. We stopped on cafeteria off an A road somewhere in the Midlands. And when we went in, there was Willie Whitelaw with a young woman who was from Central Office and a protection officer. Jim went across and then he came back and he said to me, "I hope you don't mind," he said, "Willie and I just going to have a pot of tea together. Would you?" Oh no, of course I couldn't say anything else, but yes, no. And so Jim and Willie sat there for talk, and I have no idea to this day what they talked about. But I've always thought that it was something about that generation that had gone through the war, that there was an understanding of what it was to be in politics and in public service that cut across party divisions.
Now, let's look at how important the press was in the first few years for Callaghan. Here's Stephen and Tom.
I mean, basically, everybody got a daily newspaper. Some people got a daily newspaper and an evening newspaper. So what the press's influence was at its peak in some ways. And the press was not friendly to the Labour Party. The Daily Mirror was about the only newspaper that was sort of loyal to the party and was actually loyal to Jim Callaghan's kind of Labour Party. He would talk about traditional standards that need to be revived in education and in all kinds of different areas. Law and order, he would talk about. Policing was an issue. These were kind of like relatively conservative cultural issues that I think that press was very much, they liked hearing that.
In the main, I think they were pretty good with him. I mean, better with him than they had been with Harold Wilson.
The press dubbed him Sonny Jim and Uncle Jim, but relations didn't stay so rosy. The press would go on to play a key role in Callaghan's downfall in 1979. We'll hear about that at the end of this episode. Now, let's look at one of the first big mistakes that Callaghan made, the failure to call an election in October 1978. Failing to call an election at the right time can be really damaging for leaders, and Gordon Brown also paid the price for this during his leadership, which you'll obviously hear about in his episode a lot later on in the series. Here's Tom and Stephen to discuss Callaghan's decision.
Success or failure for a leader is, do you get that timing of the election right?
I think most people, particularly around Callaghan, his closest advisors, did think that by sort of September 1978 that he would call a general election. And it was a great surprise when he didn't.
I will go to my grave believing that if we'd have gone, I think it was the 7th of November 1978, we would have won that election. Jim said to me, we've got a much better chance of keeping the unions in line after an election than one that's imminent, which I don't think was true, but that was his thinking. Well, the other reason he gave me, the psephologists would be appalled at, he told me he'd taken the Times guide to the 1974 election, the last election, and gone through it one by one, every seat, and either ticked a win or a cross against it. And when he added them up, there wasn't a majority.
But I think by this stage he was sick of hung parliaments. A lot of effort in his government had been spent on Parliament, watering stuff down, compromising, satisfying little parties. And I think Callaghan always had a side of him which was very patriotic and small c conservative. And he thought, this is probably no way to run a country long term. If the best I can do is another 5 years of this, then I probably shouldn't do it. By 78, there was a sense that Britain and the economy and so on were recovering. It's hard to recapture at this distance, but contemporary observers often did feel that stuff had started to go quite well. It's not unreasonable. Callaghan felt that they'd consolidate this progress in 79. And it didn't turn out that way, but it wasn't a stupid gamble to take.
I think the factor which plays on all political prime ministers' minds is you don't want to be a footnote. And I think there was a factor that 3 years was more substantial than 2 years.
Now let's look at what was going on with the trade unions. So while inflation in the economy had reduced, this had been done by keeping pay rises minimal, meaning workers felt poorer. Wages had fallen by 13% in real terms. In 1978, Callaghan tried to cap wage increases at 5% for the coming years. Here's Lewis Baston.
I think Callaghan did it for the best of reasons. Callaghan and Healy did want to establish the economy on a low inflation track, but I think they'd lost touch with what was realistically achievable.
I interviewed former leading trade unionist John Edmonds about these events. You will have heard from him last week. He worked at GMWU, the forerunner of GMB, in 1976, before becoming a General Secretary of GMB from 1986 until 2002. Here's John and Stephen.
Callaghan wanted a restriction on wage increases because at that time the popular fashion was to believe in cost push inflation, less so now, but it was then. So you had to keep wages down.
1978, that had proven that it had worked, but there were tensions and lots of resentments amongst ordinary trade unionists that perceived an actual standard of living were being squeezed.
The unions had agreed to the 5% wage restraint on the unspoken basis that Callaghan was going to call the election in 1978. Here's John again.
Before the time when people expected there to be an election, there was an agreement made between the trade unions and the Labour government that there will be a norm of 5% for pay rises. Now, that got through the General Council of the TUC with a very small majority. No one believed in it because inflation was way above 5%. And I mean, it began to touch 20% at one time. The conventional wisdom was that the 5% would only last until the election. And then there'll be a new negotiation with the government and a realistic figure will be put together. Callaghan came to the trade union conference and everybody expected him to announce there or immediately afterwards that there will be an election. And the conference was kept quiet, if I may put it that way, in the expectation that, well, real life was going to break out after the election was over. But Jim made a stupid speech, and so terrible things began to happen.
This feeling that the unions had that workers had been betrayed led to a period of industrial action which became the winter of discontent and led to Callaghan's downfall.
I mean, I was there, I know the story pretty well. There was a man called Peter Shaw who was given the unenviable task of keeping the trade unions in line, the trade unions having been believed with some considerable conviction that they had been misled, because it would have been very easy for Callaghan to telegraph the fact that there wasn't going to be an election in that particular way. And so Shaw fell out with everybody in the trade union movement. The relationships between trade unions and the government was about as bad as it ever could be. So the trade unions set about their business of getting the highest possible pay rises for their members who were facing very high levels of inflation.
Here's Stephen, Lewis and Tom.
The winter of discontent, both the reality of it and how it was presented in the media, basically destroyed Callaghan's hopes of winning re-election as Prime Minister.
I mean, the history of it is intriguingly different from the kind of mythology of it, in that it wasn't called by overmighty trade union leaders. It was very much a ground up thing by some miserably paid workers who had been had their pay suppressed for 3 years and had seen more powerful groups of workers like the oil tanker drivers and Ford car workers bust through the pay policy and get big pay settlements.
I mean, I had trade union leaders ringing up to me saying, oh, we can't control the strikes, but we don't want to bring down the government. But some of them did. I mean, some of them were fighting battles within their own union for control for militant reasons. But it was a fairly torrid time.
The Winter of Discontent, as labelled by Sun newspaper editor Larry Lamb, started in September 1978 and finished in February 1979, meaning months of headlines about the breakdown of the country. The most infamous strikes were by waste collectors, with images of rubbish piling up in Leicester Square, and gravediggers.
Well, there was a local dispute in Liverpool where the gravediggers did on strike, but if you read about the conditions and the pay that the gravediggers in Liverpool had, it's monstrous. They had to sort of deal with dead bodies and they didn't even have anywhere to wash at their depot, so they went home on the bus smelling of death.
This is the slogan, they wouldn't even bury our dead, and it was an absolute disaster.
I also talked to David Owen. He was Callaghan's foreign secretary. He tells us that in the height of all of this political turmoil, there was another moment in early 1979 when Callaghan seriously considered calling an early election by tabling a vote of no confidence in himself to basically say, look, I'll put my government to the test, and if we lose, we go to the country, and if we win, I'll lead with renewed authority. As David Owen sees it, it was a missed opportunity to seize control before events overtook him.
Now, I'm Foreign Secretary, and I'm there because of Jim. And my role in life is to support him on these things. He took a view, which he said to me openly, David, I don't believe the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister should disagree in Cabinet. If you want to disagree with me, by all means, we come and discuss it first. And so I didn't say anything in this argument, but I thought in my bones, this is the moment. You challenge the House of Commons, you challenge the Tribune Group, and if you're forced into election, so be it, and you'll win it. But he backed off it. That morning in the Cabinet room, he was in favour of calling a vote of no confidence. He went out to have lunch with the Chiefs of Staff, and we met again, and Roy Hattersley, who have to have declared it, came to the meeting and a few others in the House of Commons, in the Prime Minister's room, and it became obvious that something had changed. Jim was no longer determined to have an election.
So, why didn't he do it?
Because in his bones, he couldn't take on the trade union movement. He was a trade unionist in the Inland Revenue Trade Union. He had a great respect for the trade union. He was rooted in the trade union movement. The trade union movement was his weakness, and so he couldn't do it. Politics. You could, it's a very human business, really. In the end of the day, people behave pretty much to where they have reached in life, the influences of family life and the parental influences. And Callaghan was a man of the trade union movement. That was his background. That was what had given him power.
So, the Winter of Discontent continued.
It lent support to the more radical side of the Conservatives, because, I mean, in 79, the Tories were still a kind of coalition between One Nation Tories and Thatcherites. But certainly the Winter of Discontent, that experience strengthened the hands of the radicals. It was particularly kind of tragic for Jim Callaghan. He loved the Labour movement. And for it to go so wrong on his watch was something I think he felt very mortified about.
Sort of discontent, I think, at the time looked worse than it was, but the truth was that Britain was trying to come to terms with changes in our economy, from the kind of economy that had created the Industrial Revolution to the more service economy that we've got today.
Crisis, what crisis, is a quote, synonymous with political ineptitude, that was attributed to Callaghan during the Winter of Discontent.
When Callaghan came back from the Caribbean during the Winter of Discontent after a summit with all the other great leaders of the West, and he is misquoted as, coming at the airport and saying, crisis, what crisis, by the Sun, in order to give the impression that he is completely complacent, he doesn't get what the crisis is.
Callaghan actually said, "I don't think other people in the world would share the view that there is mounting chaos."
I think that shows, the limits of his positive relationship with the media. I mean, they'll stab him in the front if they can, and that obviously that quote, "Crisis, what crisis," lives with us still in our kind of cultural memory, and it isn't something he said, and it's the very opposite of what he was trying to say.
And I suppose what comes out of this is probably a good idea to tell the truth to one another rather than try to mislead them and get away with it, which is what Callaghan tried to do, and it didn't work. And we had a lot of Thatcher as a result. So it was a disaster.
In April 1979, Thatcher called a vote of no confidence, which was passed by just one vote, and an election was called for May. Although Callaghan remained personally more popular with the electorate than Thatcher, the Conservatives won the election with an overall majority of 43 seats. There was a 5.2% swing from Labour to the Conservatives, the largest swing since Attlee's landslide in 1945. Here's Stephen Fielding.
The Winter of Discontent happened, voters to sort of accept Margaret Thatcher's solutions. Callaghan's kind of way of doing things was seen as being better than her more strident, threatening approach. The Winter of Discontent just sank him. His personal authority, the ability of the Labour Party itself to manage the trade unions in a consensual way, in a way that didn't involve just being beaten over the head, was something that stuck with voters. Probably voted for the Conservatives with some misgivings, but the idea that maybe she would sort out all these problems that they were told the Winter of Discontent had confirmed.
After losing, Callaghan remained as Labour leader for a year.
He stuck around, I think, to take the sting out of the criticism of that government.
At the next Labour conference, the party was bitterly divided and the left were criticising Callaghan. Here's Lewis and Stephen.
The ministers of the departing government and the parliamentary party were just sort of held up for criticism and ridicule. The principal accusation was that they had willfully ignored the manifesto they were elected on in 1974. There's this narrative, Callaghan, etc., argued that there hadn't really been an alternative course. Left argued that there had been. It would require sort of sacrificing integration into a global capitalist economy, and that the government did make a choice, and that Callaghan was criticised for that.
It was a very uncomfortable, period for him because he had no real authority left.
Callaghan did resign in November 1980, and Michael Foot was elected as his successor. Labour would not win again until 1997. Before we move on to looking at Callaghan's legacy overall, I think it's important to look at the legacy of the Winter of Discontent itself, as it played a big role in the 18 years of opposition that Labour faced from 79. Here's Lewis.
Sort of Thatcher and post-Thatcher generation of people, the Winter of Discontent as a kind of symbol and culmination of the 70s of union power, etc., served as a nightmare. We can't possibly go back to that. And you can see the impact of that. I mean, 13 years later, 1992 general election campaign, there's Conservative Party broadcast with the Winter of Discontent. And in 97, you had Tony Blair kind of his attitude towards trade union law was very much sort of we promise we won't go back to that. And it's a nightmare which sort of only loses its strength really in the 2000s. And maybe to some extent it's still there.
Now, let's look at Callaghan's legacy.
2019 YouGov asked people who was the greatest prime minister, post-war prime minister. Jim Callaghan got 0%, right? I mean, he was not the only one to get 0%, but it's not a great bunch of people who got 0%. I think it was Theresa May, Alec Douglas-Home, and Anthony Eden, right?
Mm.
Within the Labour Party, I don't think there's been any leader that has wished to evoke Jim Callaghan as a positive role model, because he's associated, well, first of all, he's a short-term prime minister. He's associated with failure, the winter of discontent, and losing to Thatcher. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learnt from Callaghan's period, and it should be looked at more closely. And the fact it ended in failure was not necessarily down to his strategy, but to two important decisions. Those two disastrous and follow a 5% pay norm were avoidable. The Labour Party activists, and Tony Benn in particular, then said, well, you put a very moderate manifesto to the country in 79. We lost very badly. We need to go back to radicalism again. So in the short term, Callaghan was a more popular leader, more popular in his own party, but then that didn't seem to matter after the election had been lost. We live in a democracy which is fundamentally imbalanced towards the right in terms of how issues are presented, and certainly Callaghan, given the extensive, readership of primarily right-wing newspapers, had to deal with that. The winter of discontent basically sank the Callaghan government and sank him personally. In the same way that Tony Blair's reputation and legacy will always be associated with the Iraq War, fairly or not, Callaghan's is with the winter of discontent.
The loss in 1979 was seen as a rejection of the way that the economy had been managed by Wilson and Callaghan since 1964, obviously with Edward Heath in between. Here's Stephen Wall.
It's a fair judgment. I think you can credibly argue that the succession of Labour governments were a failure in terms of the state of the British economy. But I think in terms of Callaghan's leadership as Prime Minister, I would argue actually that he did put the national interest very much above a party.
He was very assiduous. He had clear ideas of what he wanted to do as Prime Minister.
Let's hear from Tom McNally, Lewis Baston and Stephen Fielding.
I think he was a very good Prime Minister, and I think if you talk to any civil servant, he was very assiduous. He had clear ideas of what he wanted to do as Prime Minister.
There was an alternate track that was available. Callaghan's Prime Ministership looks like the end of an era and looks like a kind of failure because it was the road not taken, not because it was inherently a bad way of approaching power and approaching Labour politics. What we ended up with was sort of Thatcherite transformation, and what we could have had was actually quite an interesting new direction in the way that took place in, say, Australia or France at the same sort of time under left of centre governments, but it wasn't to be.
I am certainly very proud of working with Jim Callaghan. Like all politicians, he had his faults, but I think he stood for a decency in our politics and an attempt to make the Labour Party and indeed politics in general a force for good and a force for change.
Thank you so much for listening to this Leading Labour episode on James Callaghan. Today we heard from Stephen Fielding, Lewis Baston, Tom McNally, David Owen, Pat Thane, John Edmonds and Stephen Wall. The links to read more about them, as well as links to buy their books, are in the description of this episode. Next week will be on Callaghan's successor, Michael Foot. Please subscribe so you don't miss out on that and on future episodes. This episode was researched, presented and produced by me, Izzy Conn, at the Institute of Historical Research, which you can also find out more about in the episode description. Special thanks to Will Barber-Taylor for editing and additional research, and Miranda Reed for the artwork on this episode. Music is by Rickard Fromm.